Yes, good morning. I'm Derek Milo, MAC Communications Director, and your host for this Camp County's webinar, How Will COVID Affect Community and Work Life in the Months Ahead? Joining us today are Rivka Liss-Levinson and Gerald Young of the Center for State and Local Government Excellence in Washington, D.C. And the center is a nonpartisan nonprofit group that does research to shed light on such issues and to put them into perspective for policy leaders and the public. Before Rivka gets started, I just did want to offer a couple of quick notes. We will take questions at the end, so if you do have a question, type it into the question field of your toolbar, and then we'll be dealing with Q&A after the presentation from Rivka and Gerald. Also, later today, after the presentation, the video of today's event and the slide deck will be available on the Camp Counties page at micounties.org. And then also, just to let you know, we will take a brief break in the middle of the presentation to hear a couple of messages from our corporate sponsors who make Camp Counties possible. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rivka.
Hi, good morning, everyone, and thank you so much, Derek. My name is Rivka Liss-Levinson. I am Director of Research at the Center for State and Local Government Excellence, and I am pleased to be joined by my colleague Gerald Young, also from SLGE. Now, for those of you on the webinar who may not be familiar with the Center for State and Local Government Excellence, we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan, apolitical research organization. Through our research and communications, we aim to help state and local governments become effective employers so they can attract and retain a talented workforce. It's a mission that's continued to increase in importance over the past decade, given the aging demographics of the state and local workforce, increased competition for talent with other sectors, and the evolving nature of work, among other key factors. And it will continue to be important as governments face many challenges in recovering from the COVID-19 pandemic. So SLGE's research falls into three main categories. We look at the management, sustainability, and financing of high-quality public sector retirement benefits, the provision of essential public sector health and wellness benefits, among other related quality of life considerations for state and local workers. And we look at state and local workforce demographics, skill set needs, and organizational and labor force development. So for the first part of this presentation, I'd like to discuss with you survey findings from our recent report, Public Sector Employee Views on Finance and Employment Outlook Due to COVID-19. There's also an accompanying infographic highlighting key findings from the report. Both of these resources can be viewed on the SLGE website under the Workforce section and are available for download. And as Derek mentioned, these will also be available to all participants on the webinar. So before digging into the survey results, just a few notes about the survey. With funding from ICMARC, SLGE worked with the polling firm Greenwald and Associates to conduct an online survey of 1,008 full-time state and local government employees. The survey was fielded May 4th through May 20th and covered the pandemic's financial and job impacts on state and local government workers, workers' financial profiles, and other related issues. The final data were weighted by gender, age, household income, and industry type to reflect the distribution of the state and local government workforce as found in the U.S. Census Bureau's current population survey. So first, I'm going to focus on the financial impact of COVID-19 on the state and local government workforce. As you can see on the figure on the left, more than half, 56% of state and local government employees surveyed report that they and their family have already been negatively impacted financially by the COVID-19 pandemic. 10% say they have been negatively impacted financially to a significant extent. Turning to the figure on the right, when asked how they expect the pandemic will impact them financially over the course of the next year versus where they are now, 47% say they expect the financial impact to be somewhat or significantly worse. Meanwhile, 38% expect no change, and very few, only 9%, expect the financial impact to be better. So we have a couple of figures here on this slide. Respondents were asked to what extent debt, like a mortgage, car loan, student loans, credit card debt, or medical debt, is currently a problem for them and their family. Looking at the figure on the top left, 57% report that debt's either a major or a minor problem for them, while 31% say that it's not a problem. Only 12% report not having any debt. The figure on the top right shows that over the course of the next year, 1 in 4 respondents expect that they will take on more debt than they currently have. If we move to the figure on the bottom left, about 2 of 3 surveyed, or 68%, say that they have an emergency fund set up prior to the pandemic to help pay for major unexpected expenses or to cover necessities if they lost their main sources of income. And on the figure on the bottom right, we see that among those with an emergency fund, 43% expect that they will have to dip into the emergency fund over the course of the next year to make ends meet. So looking at the figure on the left, when respondents were asked whether they expect that they will change the amount they are currently saving for retirement in the next year, 26% said that they will reduce their retirement savings. Half of respondents anticipate no changes to their savings in the next year, and 15% expect that they will increase their retirement savings. Now, when it comes to savings in general or for things other than retirement, 30% expect that they will reduce the amount they are currently saving over the course of the next year, and 27% expect that they will increase the amount that they are saving. Respondents were also asked how concerned they are that the COVID-19 pandemic and the related economic crisis will impact being able to retire when they want and being able to save enough to be financially secure throughout their retirement. Respondents show a good deal of variation in the extent to which they're concerned about being able to retire when they want. While 38% are very or extremely concerned about this, 35% are not too concerned or not at all concerned. Concerns are somewhat greater for ability to be financially secure throughout retirement. While 41% say they are very or extremely concerned about their ability to save enough to be financially secure throughout retirement, only 26% are not too concerned or not at all concerned. So next, I'm going to move on to talking about the job impact of COVID-19 on respondents. The vast majority of those surveyed, 85%, say that the COVID-19 pandemic has impacted the nature of their job. For example, what they do, where they work, or how they go about the tasks required. 41% say that it has impacted the nature of their job significantly. Looking at the figure on the right, among those reporting some impact, respondents are relatively split in terms of how difficult it has been for them to adjust to these changes. While 26% say that it has been very or extremely difficult adjusting to the changes to their job as a result of the pandemic, 38% say it has been somewhat difficult, and 37% say that it has been not too difficult or not at all difficult. So to better understand how the nature of their job has changed, respondents were asked about their current work location. While 42% are currently working remotely full-time, that is, they don't go into a workplace or interact with other people, another 29% are working mostly or somewhat remotely. Meanwhile, 1 in 4, 26%, are not working remotely. Their job requires them to go into a workplace and or to interact in person or with other people. Among those who are engaging in any remote work currently, only 18% have been working remotely prior to the pandemic. For those working remotely for the first time or more than before due to COVID-19, 22% have found it very or extremely difficult to adjust to remote work. About twice as many, 45%, say that this adjustment has not been too difficult or has not been difficult at all. Many respondents, 70%, who are engaged in remote work now or prior to the pandemic perceive their exposure at their job to people who may have COVID-19 as at least somewhat risky. 40% believe that it is very or extremely risky. One thing we were interested in was asking respondents about their concern about several elements of their job going forward. Respondents were most concerned about keeping their families safe from contracting the virus. 83% were at least somewhat concerned about this. And they were concerned about staying protected from contracting the virus at work or once they returned to the workplace. 80% were at least somewhat concerned about that. About half of respondents were concerned about having their pay reduced. 52% reported this. Having their employee benefits package reduced in some way. 50% reported this. Or having their hours severely reduced or being furloughed. 49%. Slightly fewer, 40%, were at least somewhat concerned with losing their job. Those with a spouse or a partner working were varied in terms of their concerns about the spouse or partner's job being negatively impacted by the pandemic. Well, 28% said that they are very or extremely concerned about this. 43% are not too concerned or are not at all concerned. When asked how they expect work practices, policies, and/or the work environment to change at their workplace going forward this year, respondents were most likely to think that there will be maintained social distancing. 70% reported this, and/or an increase in health protections, such as wearing masks and gloves. 66% felt that this would be implemented. Meanwhile, looking further down on the figure, only 32% thought that there would be less travel, and far fewer, 14%, thought that there would be an increase in sick leave or paid time off provided. We also asked about how state and local government workers are feeling about working in the public sector during the COVID-19 pandemic. As you can see in this figure at the top, they were most likely to value serving their community during this difficult time. 61% reported this, and to feel that the pandemic has made the public more aware of the importance of what they do. This was endorsed by 48%. Far fewer, just 1 in 5 respondents, indicated that working during the pandemic has made them consider changing jobs. Next, we looked at other more personal impacts that the COVID-19 pandemic is having on these workers. When asked what emotions they are feeling while at work about the pandemic, respondents were most likely to report feeling stressed or anxious. Interestingly, the third most common emotion reported was feeling gratitude. Unsurprisingly, as you can see in this figure, respondents were generally more likely to endorse feeling negative rather than positive emotions while at work about the pandemic. Respondents' self-reported consumption of news or media about the COVID-19 pandemic was varied, as you can see in the figure on the top left. While 25% report consuming a great deal of news or media about COVID-19, 24% report consuming not very much media. Looking at the figure at the bottom right, we asked respondents how much trust they have in government leaders to make appropriate decisions regarding employee safety during the COVID-19 pandemic. About 2 in 3 respondents reported a fair amount or a great deal of trust in state government leaders, 67%, and/or in local government leaders, also 67%. Trust in federal government leaders was much lower, with only 39% reporting a fair amount or a great deal of trust. When it comes to the amount of information respondents have received from their employer regarding COVID-19, more than half, 57%, report that they have received just enough information. 13% believe they have received too much information, and 22% believe that they have received too little information. Finally, we asked several questions about state and local government workers' financial profiles to help give some context to these responses. Respondents were asked how confident they are about making financial decisions on their own, both in general and during the COVID-19 pandemic and related economic crisis. Well, 65% reported being very or extremely confident about making financial decisions on their own in general. Fewer, 53%, said that they were very or extremely confident making financial decisions on their own during the pandemic. Finally, respondents were asked to what extent they have been able to get the help, information, and resources they need to make smart financial decisions during the pandemic. Just over half, or 53%, agree that they've been able to get the help, information, and resources needed. Only 9% report that they have not been able to get this help. And with that, I'm going to turn things over back to Derek and to Gerald.
Yes, thank you, Rivka. We're going to take a quick break here and go through a couple of sponsor messages. So stand by for that. Here's our first one from.
To everyone attending the Michigan Association of Accounting Summer Webinar here today. My name is Emma Cook. I am with Enbridge Energy and I'm a Community Engagement Analyst based here in beautiful Mackinac City. And I just want to start off today by saying thank you to all of you who work so hard every day to address the issues and concerns for our Michigan communities. My name is Candace Braddock and I'm the Senior Community Engagement Advisor. Here at Enbridge, we value our partnership with county government across the state and across every mile of our pipeline system. That partnership makes it possible to protect the Great Lakes, create good paying Michigan jobs, and deliver the fuel families, workers, and job makers rely on.
Okay, just one more sponsor message here, and we will.
Thank you for the opportunity to share a brief message as Camp County's webinar sponsor. As a sponsor for the spring conference, we were looking forward to seeing you in person. But due to the COVID-19 pandemic, we have all adapted and are now sponsoring this webinar series. EnviroLogic has had a long history of supporting the Michigan Association of Counties and its members through conferences, articles in the newsletter, and the Ask an Expert program. Although the pandemic has caused a major upheaval in all that we do, EnviroLogic continues to see a strong demand for all things related to economic development. The underlying economy continues to move forward. EnviroLogic's Environmental Services and Brownfield Redevelopment team stands ready to assist Michigan's counties with leveraging federal and state resources to help offset financial gaps that projects can face due to brownfield conditions. These can include contamination, asbestos abatement, demolition, vapor intrusion, infrastructure improvements, and site preparation issues. Brownfield tools include tax increment financing through brownfield plans, EAGLE grants and loans, various tools offered through the MEDC, and EPA brownfield assessment and cleanup grants, which will be available to apply for soon. For over 30 years, Envirologic has helped counties successfully acquire and implement these tools and resources, bringing jobs and investment to communities across the state. If you have experience with utilizing these redevelopment tools or would like an introduction and or assistance, please reach out to Envirologic's redevelopment team. Stay safe, enjoy the webinar series, and we look forward to hearing from you soon.
Okay, again, once again, thanks to our sponsors for today's event. And now I'm going to turn over screen control to Gerald as we continue our presentation.
Well, thank you, Derek. I would like to talk a little bit about the workforce side of what's going on in local government, and this stems back from a survey that the Center for State and Local Government Excellence does on an annual basis of both state and local staffing. And this one was most recently conducted in March and April, so it was in some states very early on in the virus impact, but we're tracking this type of data every year since 2009. So we're able to see not only that snapshot of what's happening this year, but also the larger trends. As you can see, most of the respondents to this survey happen to be state or local employees. A very small number represent other types of governments, and those are not reflected in the responses that you see on these figures that follow. Likewise, most of the respondents tend to be among the smaller jurisdictions. Looking at the number of FTEs in those organizations, about 74% of them are under 2,500 employees, and another quarter of them larger than that. Since we do talk about and track what's going on longer term, you can see this fairly dramatically in terms of what I would term the negative impacts on employment going back to the last recession. I think the most significant and earliest type of action that organizations take when they have some kind of a shock to their system is either furloughing staff or freezing hiring or pay. And there was a lot of that going on in 2009 through 2012. And much less, roughly 5 to 10% of organizations doing the same thing as we get to 2018, 2019. 2020, the types of actions that we were seeing were primarily in the realm of adding staff or making, again, positive changes to the organization, those that appear in blue in this chart. But still some organizations that were making preventative cuts or freezes on various types of actions like travel or training. And then we have a significant number as well that were seeing some negative impact on their organization, but again, very much in the early stages of what would happen with COVID. I think what's interesting to see in terms of this chart is not so much, things like furloughs and layoffs, which we all know have really ballooned since this time period, but the fact that even in that March-April timeframe, one of the significant changes that was going on in organizations, 8% at the very top of this figure, were reducing or restructuring services to match their available workforce. And that is to say that it's not simply a matter in good times or in bad times of just saying, oh, well, we will just hire more people, or we will just get rid of a certain share of our workforce. It doesn't happen that easily. And in many situations where you have difficulty in recruiting people for various types of work, it might be that you have what you have and you have to make do with that. And if that means you have to restructure the services, then that's what you do. This shows you a little bit of what was changing in terms of staffing versus the prior year. And this particular survey, again, even though it was conducted in 2020, was looking at what was happening in 2019 through that time period, so roughly March 2019 to March 2020, and comparing that here to what was going on in 2018. And you'll see that in most cases, if you look at the very far right side of the graph, full-time hirings, only 12% were hiring fewer staff than they did in 2018. So, really it was a period where hiring was going at a fairly healthy clip. Layoffs as well. Very few jurisdictions were seeing more than they had the previous year. And another significant factor for many jurisdictions is what's happening with those employees who are reaching the end of their careers. 27% indicated that they had staff who were reaching their retirement age and yet postponing the retirement date. And as we look at this from a longitudinal perspective, going back to 2009, 44% of those folks who were at retirement age were postponing their retirement back then. It's difficult to say whether we have the same capacity for that to happen at this stage. Certainly there have been quite a number of people who had been postponing retirement 10 years ago who have since retired, and possibly fewer who are in the position to do so this time. That's something we're going to be continuing to watch as this survey goes forward to next year as well. But I think the major challenge that we've seen in terms of organizations is the ability to fill positions. And this is not something that's so much driven by COVID or the economy. It's something that's driven in large part by the competition that's always there with the private sector. And as you look at those positions that are hard to fill on this particular figure, engineering, skilled trades, maintenance work, IT, those are all the types of positions that offer people an alternative to work in the public or the private sector. And in this case, looking at something like engineering, 28% of organizations were finding it difficult to fill those positions. If you have that choice, it may be that you decide to go with a public sector position because you've always wanted to work in the public sector, or it's a field that only exists in the public sector, and that could be the case for policing or firefighting. Beyond that, it's really a matter of how those organizations market themselves to really reach out to people, to make them aware of opportunities that exist in the public sector. And if you go to our website, we have the full version of this report. I won't get into the details here about recruiting practices, but there's plenty of information in there as well about what people were finding as the most successful recruiting practices. What I would like to focus on, though, is the fact that the difficulty is not just that, oh, well, it took us a while to find somebody to fill that position. It can also be that organizations are finding it difficult to find even enough qualified applicants versus the number of available positions that they have. So here for engineers, 61% were finding fewer qualified applicants than positions. Registered nurses, it's even worse, 77% are finding fewer qualified applicants than available positions, which in some cases leads organizations to overfill as they are recruiting. That's in the past been perhaps a little bit more typical with positions like police officers, where you might have a hiring list and you hire more officers than you might need right now, just because it takes a while to onboard those people into your organization. But again, for IT, skilled trades, engineering, nursing, there may be need for doing that further in those fields as well, and looking at what those recruitment practices are. So looking at the employment picture long term, I add this to show you the time that it really took us to come back from the last recession. It was really a matter of 10 years before local government employment bounced back. which is all the more important as we look at the drastic drop that we've had in employment so far. Granted, a significant portion of that may be temporary due to furloughs and, hopefully with some operations reopening or reimagining how they are providing services, some of that may rebound in the short term, but we're still likely looking at a long road back before we reach the level of employment that we had in 2019. Which leads us to the fact that there might be other solutions to getting the services accomplished. One of the areas that a larger number of organizations are experimenting with is gig hiring, to say that it may not be possible to find people to fill the positions that you're looking to fill at the time that you need them, or it might be that what you really need is not somebody who is full-time, but somebody who can accomplish the work on a project basis, and you're willing to hire those people in that way. As you can see here, there's only 26% of organizations that are not doing any gig hiring now. Considerable share that are doing 1 to 5%. And again, that's related to what was going on in March and April. This is, again, something we're going to be looking at very closely going forward. And you might not be surprised to see that things like office and administrative support or accounting or maintenance work kind of lead the way in terms of gig economy hiring. But what's interesting to us is that it's not just limited to these types of positions. There are quite a number of positions out there that can be accomplished via gig hiring, as well as other solutions that I'll get to in just a minute. But I think this is also telling in that, there are positive reviews that are coming in terms of what gig hiring means for management flexibility. Somewhat more mixed reviews, though, in terms of whether it makes a difference in terms of the cost of service or the productivity of the organization, and somewhat more negative views of the impact on the morale of employees. All of that is to say that gig economy can have a place in your organization, but it's something to look at very deliberately and in partnership with your existing staff to see how it can best be implemented. Now, whether you're looking at retaining new staff retaining existing staff or recruiting new staff, one of the challenges and the reasons that it's so difficult to compete with the private sector and bringing these people into your organization is that wages are not something that are easily changed in the public sector. They're obviously a matter of budgeting, a matter of available funds, and only 53% of those surveyed found that the wages that they were offering were competitive in their local labor market. They're doing much better in terms of the competitiveness of the benefits that they offer. And it's important to note that those benefits are not limited to things like retirement and healthcare, although those are very important benefits for local government employees. Those benefits might also be low or no cost provisions that are in your labor agreements or otherwise. And one of the more significant ones that obviously is coming up during this pandemic is flexible employment practices. At the time of the survey, there were only 31% of organizations that were not offering any flexible employment practices, but a majority were offering at least flexible scheduling or flexible work hours. The 27% that were offering regular telework at that time was the highest percentage that we'd seen since we'd started asking that question. And even though there is anecdotal information that comes out saying that, oh, well, we found that employees teleworking was a net negative in some way, we weren't able to track what was going on, supervision was an issue, only 2% of organizations indicated that they had decreased the level of flexible employment practices compared to the prior year. So for the most part, those that had implemented flexible employment practices were happy with it, and we're continuing to offer that to their employees. And that's even in areas like public safety that you wouldn't normally think of as being a telecommuting friendly operation. But in some of the discussion that we share in our report, might be that the entire department cannot work from home, if that's what you're talking about. But it might be that police officers can work on a modified schedule, such as a 410. It might be that certain divisions within a department might be able to work from home or from another facility. And that's the case, for instance, with some investigative units that don't need to be based out of a car or out of a station. And likewise with some of the civilian staffing, that can be the case as well. So I think it's important to consider the fact that departments are not monolithic in that sense, and that there may be room for some flexibility, even if it's not full flexibility. The type of flexibility that we're seeing tends to be in larger organizations. Here you see with flexible schedules, much more common in those with 10,000 or more employees as compared to those with less than 500 employees. But as we look at regular telework, 56% of organizations were offering that as part of this survey. Again, only 15% of those smallest organizations were offering that. But I think as we've seen in the last few months, the capacity for doing that is perhaps, as we're looking at changes in the organizations as they exist currently, certainly layoffs, furloughs are among those actions that have been taken in response to the pandemic. One of the questions that we hear a lot is this a time when organizations are deciding to cut their retirement benefits? Is it something that needs to be or can be restructured in order to save funds at this time? Most of the organizations that we were surveying indicated that they had not made changes to their retirement benefits in the last year. And in part, that's because even making a change this year doesn't necessarily impact what's going to happen to your bottom line. It may be that some of those organizations that made changes, and quite a number of them did, in the period from 2009 to 2012, the impacts that they're going to see from those changes happen over time, primarily as new employees enter the workforce, where it's typically a tiered system with those people who are still under the old provisions of the retirement plan and those who are under the modified plan. So if there were changes made in the last 10 years, we may continue to see some of the incremental changes from that. And some of the changes that have been made in those plans are already making impacts in terms of financing. You see a link at the bottom of the screen on proactive pension management. We have a report that we'd done last year on a number of cities, counties, and states that have variable benefit or variable contribution provisions fixed as part of their retirement systems, so that if there is a change in the funded ratio of the plan, if there's a change in the investment earnings of the plan, there can be automatic thresholds that kick in that say that, okay, based on that, there will be a change in the COLA that's applied or the contribution that the employer or the employee make. So some of those provisions might be coming into effect as well beyond any new legislation or changes to the plans. But another reason that local governments are not necessarily jumping into the idea that, yes, we need to change our retirement plans, is that pension benefits do have an impact on your ability to recruit. And without getting into all of the details of this study, I will just point you to the link to read more on it. But basically, there is a 2.9% decrease that we found in the ability to hire talent for those positions that you're looking for as compared to those that can go to the private sector instead. Health benefits, like retirement benefits, we're seeing a number of organizations that are changing, not necessarily wholesale the plans that they're offering, but are changing perhaps the cost share between employers and employees. And in terms of employee retention and development, lots of attention spent on developing the staff that you've already got. And I think that's a significant factor that I'll get to in just a minute here, but it's not a matter of just saying, hey, we are having trouble recruiting new people, but it's a matter of retaining those people that you've got in the organization. And when we often engage with those staff is as they're leaving the organization, we ask them, hey, what was it that caused you to leave? Very typically in the responses that we were seeing, it's lack of advancement opportunities. Feeling like they can't move on within their existing department, or they find an opportunity with another employer. But among the other responses that we were getting on this is that, hey, there are some organizations that do exit interviews, and quite a number of them do that in this survey, but there are also those that are doing stay interviews and talking to their employees long before they decide to leave the organization. And in terms of that discussion that you're having with the employees, finding ways that you can develop them as resources that will continue to organization. I think the final aspect of the workforce data that I'd like to talk about is what people were seeing looking ahead. Obviously, having a competitive compensation package is a part of that, but what I'd really like to call your attention to are the two items toward the bottom that are asterisked, and that is the impact of technology. It's a factor in retaining staff, and it's also a factor in the potential modification or elimination of jobs. This is not to say that people are necessarily looking to either one of those as a path that they want to go down, but it's one that they know is going on and they need to address it in some way. And I think that's where we are seeing much more attention going forward, particularly in this COVID environment, to looking at how you're going to adapt to the technology. Certainly, we're all seeing more in the way of Zoom meetings and online engagement, not only with your own staff, but with the public. But there's also a certain level of process improvement going on. Looking at the ways that you've always done things, looking at things that had been paper-based, purchasing processes that needed physical signatures, and finding ways not only to work around those roadblocks that might exist, but whether it's through Lean Six Sigma or other strategies, trying to find ways that you can re-engineer those via technology to be more productive and to find a way to impact the culture as well. And I think that's one of the challenges that we're all finding here. Yes, it's one thing to say that we want to bring artificial intelligence, for instance, into the HR process, to use more tools that can help us scan through a large number of recruitment applications quickly. But you also have to look at what the public's expectations are and how you are effectively engaging with them. And particularly at the local government level, there is a culture that says, hey, I want to be able to deal with my public services in person. Sure, there's a way that I could submit a subdivision plan electronically, but I'm not doing something so cookie cutter as that. I have a backyard deck that I want to build, and I want to deal with that permit or this business license application or whatever the process is in person, because I want to discuss that with somebody, because I want to hold them accountable. maybe because I want to meet with my elected officials in person. There are plenty of people out there that want to pay a utility bill in person because that's the way that they interact. Maybe they have limitations in terms of their access to the internet or their familiarity with the technology. And in order to get to this new place that we may be heading, it's one thing to say, hey, we can do online services for these various services that we're providing, but how can we do this in a way that brings people along, that helps them to understand the ways in which we are reaching out to them, providing not just their 3 minutes at the microphone at a public hearing, but truly recognizing the fact that in some cases, in person may still be the way that certain services are delivered, even if those are perhaps reimagined. And the other way in which I think all of these organizations are going to be re-looking at things is in ways that they can work cross-sector or cross-department. And we've already seen that there are some areas where layoffs or furloughs took place, that it did not make sense to have extremely high-touch services provided in person. And those might have been things like gymnasiums or community centers or things that, it's just a significant disease vector that we wanted to cut down on. But there are also areas that there are significant needs for staffing right now, whether that's in contact tracing or in social services and reaching out to vulnerable populations. And in some cases that might be within a county government, but it might also be reaching between county and city and special district and school district and other organizations that potentially are seeing either layoffs or furloughs or need for additional staffing, and finding ways that they can work together to perhaps make use of the resources that they have currently without losing them. Again, recruitment is such a difficult prospect in a good economy. When we are dealing with changes in staffing models right now, it might be that the new staffing model that we need to look at is, hey, we have existing capacity in this department. Is there somebody else within the county or within some other agency that has a need right now that we can retain these people so that when we are ready to ramp up, if they are working on a project basis for a certain length of time with this other agency, we can still have them as a part of our team, continue to grow in terms of their skills, abilities, and experiences with another public agency, and then retain that option to bring them back into your operation later on. And I've got a couple of links up here, some dealing with public health specifically, but we've also got a checklist on our website that deals with really staff sharing in a more general way and some of the considerations that you might want to keep in mind as you're going about starting something like that. And the most recent of those is one that deals with staff sharing between the local governments and the military. And I'd encourage you to check that one out as well. In addition to just any of the general SLGE resources that we have available, you can reach out to us via email or just at slge.org. And with that, I'd like to turn things back over to Derek for Q&A.
Great, thanks Gerald, and thank you Rivka. We do just have a few minutes for Q&A, and while giving members a little more time to type in their questions, I did just want to pose one of my own that isn't necessarily COVID specific, but it's something I think many of our members are going to be facing, and that's the kind of a huge generational shift in their workforce, in the sense that quite a bit of their workforce would have been from the baby boomer generation, and they're seeing a large wave of retirements, and counties are going to be hiring for positions that quite frankly they might not have hired for in quite some time. So can you, either of you, advise on, just in general, what are, the best tips right now for trying to recruit new employees to public service?
Sure. Yeah, I'd be glad to address that. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, I was not getting into all of the details of what's in our survey, but part of that did deal with recruitment strategies. And the recruitment strategies you use to reach people who are, my age or older, might be different than the strategies that you would use to reach out to the 18 to 30-year-olds. And highest on the list were things like social media outreach and relationship recruiting that in some way, looks at perhaps referrals from existing employees. But I think very important in this recruitment spectrum is really selling the public service aspect of working for the county. There are a number of organizations that we've published case studies on that have really made a marketing push around being a part of a larger effort, serving your community and taking pride in that public service. And, particularly as you're looking at something like an IT job, there's very little to distinguish one IT job from another unless you happen to be working for Microsoft or Google and you're going to be, working barefoot with a ping pong table in your office. But for most of us, if you're going to be, let's say, a network administrator for one company or for one county, how are you going to make the decision between those? And if going to work for a corporation gives you, a certain compensation and benefits package, and going to work for the county gives you not only, perhaps a slightly better benefits package or one that appeals to you more, but it also gives you that intangible sense of job satisfaction because you're making a difference for the community. That might be what tips the scales and convinces you to make a difference for an organization, to see the difference that you make.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. Oh, if I could just add. So I completely echo what Gerald is saying, especially in terms of the idea of, this being a workforce that's really mission driven, and really looking to appeal to that element of working in the public sector. The other thing I would say is I think there's sometimes a tendency to think about shifting generations and to kind of pigeonhole a little bit in terms of baby boomers like this versus millennials like that versus Gen Z, likes that. And I think one thing we see consistently across all of these different age groups is this mission-driven motivation for entering the public sector. So I think it's sometimes, as I said, there's kind of a tendency to think that there's these huge differences between different age groups, but I think there are a lot of similarities. And the other thing I would also note is I think now more than ever, we're seeing that there are differences that may relate more to life stage rather than to age itself. So I would recommend that when looking to fill positions, that folks are thinking about what specifically the candidates that they're looking for, what appeals to those individuals rather than thinking about it in terms of what appeals to an age group. We see more than ever that, you have a 40-year-old who is still paying off student loans versus a 40-year-old who is just starting a family versus a 40-year-old whose real focus is on taking care of elderly parents. So I think that there's that piece of it as well.
Yeah, and that certainly comes into play in terms of the types of benefits, whether that's paid family leave or otherwise.
Yep.
The other item that I'd also add is that reaching out to the school age population is important as well, not from the standpoint that they will be your employees tomorrow, but making them aware of the basic civics and the role that the county plays in providing the services all around them is important, so that 5 or 10 years later, they are already aware that, gee, that might be a path that I'd like to follow.
And with
Excellent.
COVID-19, I mean, there's, the opportunity has kind of never been higher to, show civics in action, and to, explain what the different, roles are of people in local government. So I couldn't agree more, Gerald.
All right, great. Well, I do not see any other questions queued up, and we are reaching the end of our hour. So I do want to thank Gerald and Rivka for the presentation today and giving us time and sharing their expertise. I also want to thank our sponsors for today's event, particularly Enbridge and EnviroLogic. Just another reminder, today's video and slide deck and handouts will be available on the Camp Counties page at micounties.org later today. At that same page, when you visit, you can also sign up for the 5th and final Camp Counties webinar this year, which will be on election security issues in 2020. So please sign up for that and encourage your colleagues to do the same. And with that, I am going to wind down the webinar, and I hope that you stay safe and stay healthy.
Yes, thank you.